If you are a longtime fan of Tech Field Day, one of the things you may have noticed in the last year or so is that we like to find some interesting projects going on in the open source community and shine a spotlight on them so that the audience that we have is capable of learning about them and seeing some new and interesting technology. If you've watched the events in the past, you noticed that a lot of those projects were storage related, but guess what? Networking has cool things too. And thanks to our friends at the Linux Foundation, especially Lisa Kaywood, longtime friend of Tech Field Day, we found one of those projects, and it is the coolest animal that you're ever going to see. It is the Panda project. If you are watching this at home right now, you can go to PNDA.io to see what this is about. But for the next hour, you're going to get to hear two of the principal parts of the project tell you all about what's going on.
I'm Marc Cohn. I'm from the Linux Foundation. I've been involved in the Linux Foundation network and orchestration portfolio, which we'll get into in just a minute. And today we're very excited to talk about our analytics platform, where networking meets analytics. You can think of it in those terms. What we have today for you is a couple of topics. First, I just want to provide a little bit of a backdrop, not just on the subject matter, but also on open source in general. Because as we were discussing at the beginning of this session, we don't offer products, we don't get involved in commercial discussions. What the Linux Foundation does is it enables a shared technology investment and collaboration for a number of different projects in many domains. Today we're going to talk about the networking domain. Then we're going to introduce John Evans, again the lead developer, or really the project lead for Panda and one of the early pioneers. And he's going to talk about the actual project, the architecture, some of the key functionality and some target use cases. And then we're going to go into some additional details depending on what you'd like to see, and we do have some latitude in where we want to go. But before we get started, I just wanted to give you some perspective on the Linux Foundation network and orchestration portfolio, because Panda is not a standalone project, and it's not our only project in the networking world. As a matter of fact, way back in 2012, we created an open source project called OpenDaylight, which is a SDN controller framework that's enabling many organizations, including some of the world's largest e-commerce providers, in providing SDN in software-defined networking, for those of you not familiar with that domain, into the technology, into their networks, and actually also into their business. Now, next, we actually introduced a project that was called OPNFE, and actually we also had a relationship for another open source SDN controller project that was called ONOS. Now, OPNFE is an open reference platform, and the idea is to be able to provide a tool for developers by allowing open source projects to be integrated on top of an infrastructure that developers can use to sort of explore and integrate pieces together and also learn from. And also a number of demos have been provided as well. Next, as we move along in terms of the scope, we actually also address the data plane. So we started out in the control layer. We sort of took this excursion into an integration project, and now we are moving down the stack with the data plane. And this is including OVS, or Open vSwitch. I think many of you are familiar with that. It's one of the most prevalent virtual switches. The Fast Data I/O project is another project that's into data plane and packet processing acceleration only in user space versus having to go and deal with the kernel. And it provides a toolkit to enable a whole range of different packet processing applications. And then we also introduced another reference architecture called CORD, and it has to do with some carrier, the carrier and cloud coming together, and there's additional details if anyone's interested afterwards. And then finally, we moved up the stack. So we started in the control, we moved down the stack, now we're moving up the stack. And this is some very exciting announcements. The Open Network Automation Platform gets involved in orchestration for very large service providers. This provides an opportunity to do end-to-end service orchestration. And then, of course, Panda comes into the picture as well, which we'll be talking about the rest of the time. Now, so our portfolio really spans quite a bit, and you can see that it's been accelerating over the years. We started out with one project, now we have about 10. As a matter of fact, At the Open Networking Summit event, we announced that DPDK is now a Linux Foundation collaborative project, not to mention free-range routing again. So we've been rounding out our portfolio in response to organizations approaching the Linux Foundation so they could leverage the best practices and the infrastructure, and most important, the community building that's required for successful open source projects. Well, let's talk about what is successful open source projects. I think it pays to give you a sense. I'm sorry that this is a little bit small, but hopefully you're looking on your on the webcast. But first of all, these projects are moving from regional projects to global projects in a big way. They're starting to move from a single source who's providing the code into multiple sources. And these projects that are actually gaining momentum within the Linux Foundation are actually starting to become platform projects that many organizations are interested in plugging into. So when you think about how Panda fits into a broader framework, it's really through whatever your favorite vendors are doing and how they adopt these open source components and open source platforms and deliver a solution or deliver pieces that you can actually integrate and adopt within your network infrastructure. These projects used to be purely developer-centric in the sense that developers got together, typically working for vendors. These are not necessarily projects that are being independently supported, even though we welcome such support. And those vendors were making a lot of decisions about what they expect their customers to address. Whereas in the ultimate sense, what we really want to do is to blend the developer-centric view with end users who are actually thinking about adopting these projects. That's a big part of open source. And standards play a role to some extent, and in the past, they've played in some cases, no role just because open source has become the standard. Whereas as we get to larger and larger platforms and more significant functionality, we're going to see a blending of open source and standards. Not only are we going to see that, we're going to see technology adoption turned around on its side, where open source becomes the driver behind some standards eventually. And it's certainly going to become more of an iterative process. And then finally, these projects have been hyped quite a bit in industry. They've been hyped in the media. What we're trying to do is to gain a little more control so we can understate these projects as they start to roll out so they can actually mature in a reasonable way, and we can actually set the expectations of those who are adopting. So, we look at these projects and they're starting to adopt a cycle of what open source is all about in contemporary networking, and that's actually going to actually include a number of contributors that are from many different organizations, a very collaborative environment so that not only a single organization is participating, but we have diverse participation on individual projects. We're not quite there with Panda, but we're getting there. And then we're going to have the respect of the community to be able to ensure that we have an environment that's going to foster the ultimate benefit of open source, which is this community development and collaboration. So now I want to just share with you another perspective on open source. This is actually a slide I pulled from our tutorial that we gave a little bit earlier this week. And this is, we want to talk about the human side of open source. And to do that, we want to draw from one of the biblical references, the seminal references. Everything I really need to know I learned in kindergarten. This is a long-standing book that we love to draw from because the lessons in open source are really are very critical. They're very applicable. First of all, share everything. Work open. Open is open. Open is not, we do side discussions and the like, and we don't publish documents or we have closed meetings. This is an open community. Play fair, speaks for itself. Clean up your own mess. If you make a problem and break a build, or you actually come in and try to destabilize something because of whatever action you took, you got to take responsibility, you and your organization. And then say sorry when you're hurt. This is about people. This is the key of this whole open community. It's not about technology. It's about people working together. And then when you go out into the world, stick together. This is a community. This is not something that is just individual organizations trying to get the best of one another. Now, of course, there are common interests. It's just a question of how do you actually take advantage of the community versus the individual contributions? That's key to open source. And then finally, this is one of the keys. You know, the sandbox that's best are the ones that the kids are in it. And it's certainly the ones that have the most toys, especially when those toys are code contributions. And these are some of the guidelines that we've used and applied and adopted for the Linux Foundation best practices in open source to be able to get to sustainable communities and platforms like our many networking projects that are in varying stages of maturity.